I am Alicia Hart here. This is the second Lunch and Learn that is specific to early childhood. Stephanie and I had a session last week on the basics of ABA for families who are new to the diagnosis of ASD or new to any sort of interventions, including applied behavior analysis. We're going to kind of continue with the early childhood theme. And today we're going to talk about preparing your child for the early childhood classroom in the time of COVID-19, which we know is a very unique time for everyone, including our youngest children. We do want to start by saying that every division is going to be different. Every school building is going to have different situations and rules and routines, and we can't possibly talk about every single scenario that might unfold in the state over the next few months. So we just want you to know that this is from a very broad and general perspective, but we will have some questions at the end where we can talk about maybe some more specific questions. And bear in mind that I have two screens rolling right now, so I'm going to try and make this as fluid and as seamless as possible, but every now and then I just might mess up. Okay, so a little housekeeping here today. We do record these sessions, and we will have them on YouTube and on our website within a couple of days. When we do record, but just by being here, you consent to being recorded, but we do edit out any identifying information before we post these online. And as well, the Q&A section is also removed and is really only shared as an anonymous transcript. So welcome to our session. If you came here last week, then you know that I'm Alicia Hart. And if you're new, hello, I'm Alicia Hart. I've been with ACE for many years. I basically do all the stuff that has anything to do with training. So if you've ever watched a course with us, if you've ever seen a how-to video, if you've ever read a fact sheet, most likely I've had my hand some way, shape, or form in that product. So you have, some of you may recognize my voice from some of the courses or videos that we produce, because I am the behind the scenes person in developing a lot of that. I also work with Stephanie on an early childhood specific project called Project PASS. And that's a professional development project for early childhood teachers and paraprofessionals and related service providers to learn more about best practices for autism spectrum disorder. Stephanie, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, welcome again to today. If you were here, you got my spiel about my background. I am Stephanie Paul. I'm a Training and Technical Assistance Associate with ACE, so kind of the training that Alicia just spoke about. I work and help with that. And then I also go out into school divisions to help them improve practices and programming for students with autism. And I am also a board certified behavior analyst, so a BCBA. I was a early childhood special ed teacher for about 18 years in the Virginia public schools. So I do have, I would say that's kind of my niche, my area of expertise would be early childhood. So welcome again. We're glad to have you with us today.
Okay, so here's some of the objectives for today. Maybe my other computer is frozen. Okay, so we are going to discuss the challenges related to school openings right now because of COVID-19. We're also going to talk about the evidence-based practices that will support the needs of young children as they transition into the classroom. And we're going to have some examples of some ways to use different practices or strategies with some of the changes that are going to be happening. And of course, at the end, we'll have a question and answer opportunity for everyone. So I want you to keep in mind as we start talking about this, we have two different kinds of students coming into the fall semester. We have children who were in preschool before, and they were there last spring before COVID hit, and they had very, different rules and routines back then. Yes, there was some hand washing, but it probably wasn't going to be the focus as it is this fall. So they have already been in a preschool classroom. They already have some idea of how that it unfolds and what some of the routines and rules are. So they're going to have to learn different rules and routines. So that's going to be a little bit of a unique situation, right? And then we have children who have never been in a preschool setting at all. They're not accustomed to any school-based rules or routines or schedules. They don't really know what to expect. And so as you move forward, as we talk through some of these situations and strategies, keep in mind which type of child that you have here. Do you have a child who needs to learn new routines and rules, or ones that are learning different routines and rules, right? It will make a little bit of a difference when we talk about some of the strategies. So what are some of the potential changes that we might see this fall? Now, this is not an exhaustive list. Everybody and every division may have more or less that they are going to have in terms of changes. But some of the things that we might see based off some of the things that have been in the news and some districts and divisions have been talking about, so there might be new bus riding rules. That might just be something where we're trying to increase that social and physical distancing between children as they're on the bus. It may not be that where we're trying to squeeze 3 children in a seat. Maybe it's we're only doing 2. Maybe we're only doing family members that are on the same seat. Maybe we're trying to only do 1 child per seat. There's going to be different drop off and pickup changes. One of the biggest things that I've seen, especially for young children, especially children who are just new to going into school, is that mom or dad or their caregiver can't follow them all the way to the classroom. And, one thing I didn't say in the beginning when I introduced myself is that I am also a parent of a child with ASD. So I can tell you the fear I would have, the very first day I took my son to preschool, and he didn't speak independently. He used a communication device. So I was always worried about what he could or couldn't communicate, or what happened in the day and things like that. And so I can imagine the fear I would have as a parent, not being able to walk that child all the way to their classroom, or to have like just that little conversation with their teacher every morning or every afternoon when I picked him up. And so there's going to be big drop-off changes for families that are going to be new. It's going to be drop-off changes for children that, if you've been to the classroom before and then now all of a sudden mom can't follow you all the way to the classroom, that's different. We might have temperature checks that are happening. Maybe it's regularly as you enter the building, or maybe it's just as if, if you're displaying any symptoms of, not feeling well or things like that. But temperature checks may be a new part of the day. Of course, we might see teachers wearing masks or a face shield in some way, or maybe bus drivers. Perhaps students have to wear them in some way, shape, or form, especially if they can't socially or physically distance in certain activities. We are definitely going to see increased hand washing, whether that's, as we walk into the building throughout the day. It used to be just kind of when we came in and maybe before snack. Now it might be a little bit more often. We might see more hand sanitizer being used. We might see increased cleaning throughout the day, or maybe children are expected to help clean up or use their own individual supplies. Physical distancing, we've all been to the grocery store in the last few months. We've seen the nice little lines that tell you where to stand. That means that you're 6 feet apart. That's going to be a part of the school environment as well. So when we're lining up to get off the bus or on the bus, or we're lining up to go into the cafeteria or to the library, we might see these lines that show us how far apart to be. There may be differences in how the children play. It might be that, outdoor play is different. It might be that some of our indoor play looks different as well. We might have quarantines. We might have children or teachers that get sick, and that classroom may need to be quarantined, or we might have an entire school closure because there's maybe an isolated outbreak. These are all changes that we need to think about and prepare our children for when we talk about moving into the classroom. Now, some of these things that we've talked about, we've already sort of experienced as a community. So if you have taken your child to the grocery store, you and your child have experienced some of the things that you see on the screen here. So we have like the where to stand in line as you're kind of checking out somewhere. We also have new changes to somehow, like sometimes when we enter a store, there have been times where I live that, they've only allowed certain numbers of people in, and so you have to stand and wait outside. Sometimes if there's been multiple entrances into a building before, there's now only one entrance, so they can kind of make sure who's coming in and coming out. If you're at a waiting area, like say at the doctor's office, you've probably noticed some of the signs on the chairs that say sit here, don't sit here, that help people space out and be more socially and physically distant. We've also seen a lot of the visual supports that you see on the screen here. So you've seen signs to remind you to socially distance and what that looks like, like keep 2 carts apart, as you're shopping in the store. Or if you've been to a playground, you've seen some of these things that say, maybe now's not a good time. There's all kinds of rules, and we're all being exposed to these in our communities as a whole. So it's not as if this is going to be very unique for our children. It's something that they're probably already have seen somewhere in their life. So what are the ways that you can help support young children with autism as they transition back to school in the time of COVID-19? I can tell you as a parent, we're often looking for a magic wand, right? We want something to make this really easy and very quick and simple, and boom, there it is. Everybody's prepared, ready to go. Generally what happens though is that we've got things like evidence-based practices. Some of these are actually pretty easy to do. None of these are a magic wand, okay? So some of these take some work, they take a little bit of practice, they take a little bit of, tweaking to get it just right. But these are the things that we talk about all the time, whether COVID is here or not. We know that these evidence-based practices work, especially for children with ASD, especially for young children with ASD. So everything on this list is going to be beneficial in some way. Some of these might be more beneficial in terms of explaining some of the stuff for for COVID-19, and we'll get to that in just a second. But all of these things are going to help this child prepare for all parts of their life, okay? Not just COVID-19. So these are the things that Steffi and I, when we're talking with schools and we're helping them implement evidence-based practices, these are the things that we talk about with teachers all the time. So sorry, I just got distracted by the chat feature. And now I can't figure out how to turn it off. Oh boy. I am so sorry. Hold on here. I have way too many things on my screen. I always tell Stephanie, whenever we do these, I feel like I'm like an airport controller and I'm landing planes. It's very complex from my end here. Okay, so let's get back on track. These are the things that Stephanie and I talk about with all of our divisions and our teachers who are wanting to know how to do best practices in the classroom. So this isn't something special that we only talk to parents about, or it's something that we only talk with teachers about. This is something that we want everyone to be using all the time, whether or not it's for COVID or it's just a regular day. The best thing about evidence-based practices is they can be used anywhere, at any time. So that means they're good in the classroom, they're great for using at home, they're great for using in the community. It's not as if they're situational specific. So if you learn to use some of these at home or in the community, it also helps your child use them in the classroom. So think about that when we talk about preparing our children for life in the classroom, even in the time of COVID-19. If we're all using some of the same evidence-based practices, that child is going to feel more confident and prepared and just able to handle some of the changes that are happening. So when we talk about those evidence-based practices, some of the best ones that I think personally, and Stephanie and I have talked about, some of the best ones for teaching all of these changes that are coming and preparing children for the changes that are going to happen in their day. We think these ones that are underlined are probably going to be the best one for this situation. So let's go over some of these so we kind of make sure that we understand what these are. So when we talk about physical structure is really, it's kind of the way that we organize the arrangement of items in the environment, right? And there's a flow to things. So when you think about a preschool environment, you've all been in a preschool classroom probably at some point, or you have an idea of what a preschool classroom looks like. This means that when you walk in, there's a place for the cubbies and where that you put your things. It's nice and organized, right? You know that there is generally there's some sort of imaginative play area. So sometimes that's a kitchen. It's got like a kitchen and it has maybe some dress up clothes, and maybe there's some other types of imaginative play that are in there. There's also usually a block play area where children can play with blocks or Legos or things like that. There's generally a place where children can sit and do like a large group activity, where sometimes you do like the circle time, they do the welcome to the day and stuff like that, where there's all different places to sit. Sometimes there's also small group activities where there's small tables and there's small groups of tables there where children can sit. Usually there's a flow to that, right? Like, when you walk in, you can kind of see what the expectation is for different areas. That's what physical structure is. It just kind of helps you understand the expectations for what to do and where to go for different things. Visual clarity is a way to kind of structure and what a child sees, right? And so some of that is we're going to reduce the distraction. So I know that you have all been into a classroom at some point where you're like, wow, there's a lot going on in here. You know, there might be a lot of things hanging from the ceilings. There's really colorful things on the walls. And some of this is fun and it's age appropriate, it's developmentally appropriate. And sometimes we can go a little overboard and it's distracting, right? So visual clarity for, you know, this purpose is to make sure that what we're using serves a purpose, right? And it's not just an explosion of color and sights and sounds and all this other stuff, but it helps you understand what to do, where to go, what the expectations are. For visual clarity for, like, say, a classroom, sometimes we might use color coding that would help you understand where something goes or that there's a flow to something. Visual supports. Individuals with ASD are often visual learners. They're not always, but often. And that means that a visual learner prefers, whether it's an idea, a concept, or some other kind of information, that it's associated with an image or other information, like, say, a graph or a picture or an organizer or an illustration. So when we talk about a visual support, we're talking about some sort of picture, a schedule, you know, kind of a, maybe it's compared with a word. So let's just say if we had a locker that we're supposed to put some of our stuff, a visual support would have a picture of our coat and our backpack, and it would probably also say coat and backpack on there, right? So a visual support just makes anything that you would say to a child, like, here's a place to go, or here's where you would put your stuff, it makes it concrete, and they can look at it again and again, and they can see and understand what that expectation is. When we talk about schedules and routines, schedules are, you know, the same schedules that all of us have, right? It's just visual. And so we would have a visual schedule for that child's day. It might be like when we go to school, when we put our backpack away, when we sit down for circle time, when we move to, say, a small group, we have some other playtime or snack time. It's all going to be on the schedule, and they can see it and refer to it again and again. A routine is just the things that we do throughout the day. Like, you know, when we get up in the morning, our routine is to wake up. Sometimes we go and we have our coffee if we're adults. We'll take a shower, we'll have our breakfast, we'll get dressed, we'll head off to work. That's our routine, right? A lot of times we can make routines visual, and we can show children what to do and how to complete that routine independently. Transitions, we talk about transitions for students with ASD. You know, this can be a difficult thing because a lot of times they don't like to stop what they're doing and shift gears and do something else, especially if they're doing something that they prefer. So if you have an activity or, you know, something that child's doing that they're really interested in, they're really passionate about this thing, a lot of times they don't want to stop doing that and do something that's less preferred. Maybe we're talking about, you know, cleaning up or hand washing or something like that. That's going to be hard for them to stop what they're doing, shift gears, and do the thing that they don't like. But there are ways that we can support that. A lot of times we use their strengths and interests as a way to help transition them to the thing that they don't like. Sometimes we'll use things like a first then. So first I've got to do something I don't really like, and then I can do something that I enjoy. And so that's how we might support someone with transitions. And choices are on here too. Choices aren't one of the underlying ones, but providing an opportunity for choice is always a good idea, right? It's always a good idea. Functional communication, just so that we're all on the same page here, functional communication just refers to the ability to say things like, I need help, stop, no. It's all those really basic things that help us get information out without having to use behavior, right? So if you can't say, I need help, and you can't say those words, or you don't have a picture, or you don't have a device that would help you communicate that, you're going to use behavior in some way, right? Same thing is true for our children with ASD. So we always want to be supporting functional communication. AAC just refers to augmentative and alternative communication. And this is just for children if they're not using, you know, verbal language, that they have another way to communicate. For some children, that's using picture exchange. For other children, it might be using sign language. It might also be using something like a high-tech device, like maybe an iPad or a device that speaks for them as well. Social narratives, though, these are really, really important when it comes to explaining anything to children with ASD, right? And you would think, oh, how important really is a social narrative, especially in times of COVID-19? Well, let me tell you, there was something, there's a SPARK study that happened in the spring, and SPARK is just, it's a group of, of families that we can kind of ask questions on and do research, right? So these families have volunteered to be part of this ongoing research project, right? And one of the questions that came up in the spring when all of this was happening with COVID-19 was, well, what have you been doing to help your child with ASD understand everything that is happening? I mean, this is hard for everybody, just everybody, let alone children with ASD. And the number one thing that families said was helpful were social narratives. So what is this magical thing, right? What is this great tool that everybody's using that's helping? It's just a story that helps the child understand what is happening, what to do, why something occurs. It really is just a great way to explain visually to children with ASD about something that's important, right? And so again, it's a lot like a visual support where it's paired with words and there's pictures on there. And it can, these can be made and individualized in a number of ways, right? So we might have children that use a whole bunch of different ways of understanding the world. A social narrative can be individualized. So it's an exceptionally wonderful tool. Video modeling is really just what it sounds like. It's using a video to show someone what to do or how to do it or what to expect. So social narratives and video modeling are going to be really, really important on this. There's some other things that are also really important that we talked about last week that Stephanie talked about when we talked about the basics of ABA. So Stephanie, if you just want to give a real quick overview of what those are for task analysis, modeling and prompting and reinforcement, just to remind everybody.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So if you look at the column that talks about applied behavior analysis and those principles, and if you were with us last week, you would have received the much more in-depth talk and explanation of these. I'm just going to go over these really briefly. But task analysis really involves taking a more complex skill and breaking it down into small manageable parts. So when Alicia referred to some different things that you may see like hand washing and so forth, just taking down all those steps of when somebody says wash your hands, what would that actually look like would be a sequence of many different skills or steps put together in order to kind of accomplish that task, if you will. And so task analysis just involves breaking those down and one of the nice things about that is some of these other areas like visual supports, it's really nice that you can take not only and break down those skills, but then add some of those supports. So for example, taking those steps of hand washing and be able to break them down into those smaller steps and teach those steps very directly. And then modeling is just demonstration or showing, can be very powerful, especially thinking about, again, if young children with ASD are, strong visual learners, if they can see something and see that model take place, then hopefully they can imitate what that person has modeled for them. So it's just showing or demonstrating the skill or the action that you are trying to teach. And then prompting is any assistance. So it could be a cue, it can be verbal, it can be kind of giving physical help. So we talk a lot in teaching about hand over hand. So that's physical, some sort of physical guidance to help the child exhibit that response or that behavior that you're working on. So that targeted what you are hoping to accomplish. And so any kind of assistance that's provided would be prompting. And so the really important thing about prompting is that you want the child to be successful. And so the prompt is what helps to kind of get that to occur. And then once that behavior occurs, we want to be sure that we provide positive reinforcement. So when you actually see a target skill happen, we of course want to make a big deal about it and attach some sort of sometimes it's a tangible, sometimes it can be social praise. Reinforcement is different. The real definition of reinforcement, though, that we need to be careful about, a preference isn't necessarily a reinforcer. So that consequence, that thing that happens right after a behavior occurs, we just need to really be careful that if it increases the likelihood that, again, in that same set of circumstances, that you see that skill again, then yes, if that increases, then that's reinforcement. So we have to look at what are those interests and sometimes those strengths and things so that we can use those to hopefully provide reinforcement, because that's how learning takes place, by those consequences after a behavior. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
So I know we went through those pretty quickly. So if any of those are unfamiliar or you're still a little unsure of what these things mean, We have a lot of resources at the BCUA's website, and we'll talk about it at the end, but we have tons of things to help bring you up to speed on any of these. So don't be stressed out if you're not 100% sure on all of these, okay? Okay, so let's go through some examples, right? So if we're talking about how to explain COVID-19 to a very young child, right? So what can we do? Well, we're going to say social narrative a lot. You're going to get tired of me saying social narrative by the end of this, but they are that important. So we want to make sure that we're using or creating a very age-appropriate social narrative about COVID-19. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, there's tons of these out there. So you don't have to start from scratch. If you can find one that's already been made, there's no sense in reinventing the wheel, right? And making your own. But you can make your own and individualize it as much as you need to. We have some at BCUA that are for young children. There's some for older children. There's some that's like that look like a comic book. Autism Speaks has tons of them. There's lots of different places out there that are making social narratives for young children with ASD. But make sure that we're talking about what this is, why it has changed our life, and why this means that you have to wash your hands more often. Don't assume that a child doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand. I always want to presume competence in every individual with ASD, no matter their age, including 2- and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. So we want to make sure that we're presuming that they are competent and that they can understand when we explain this in age-appropriate language or in the right visual supports. There's also a lot of age-appropriate videos out there about COVID-19. Now, BCUA's has some, but I don't know that they're necessarily for very young children. We talk about what a virus is. We talk about hand washing. We talk about some of these things. Some of them are going to be age-appropriate, and some of them might be for older children, because ACE does work with the entire lifespan. We're not just talking about early childhood all the time. We're talking about children and students of all ages and even young adults. We also want to make sure that we're being very positive and reassuring about what is happening. One of the best examples that I can give about this is, in COVID-19, a lot of times we've had to stay at home, right? We've had to kind of keep ourselves socially distanced and be at home. And there's, you can say we're stuck at home, and it's very easy to say that I'm stuck at home and I can't get out. And, oh, this is terrible. But you can reframe that into a positive by saying we're safe at home. So make sure that when we're talking about some of these changes that are happening with COVID-19, that we're focusing on the positive, that this keeps us safe, it keeps us healthy. All of the things that we're going to do are there to help our entire community. What about preparing your child for the bus ride? So if your child is going to ride the bus, maybe it's for the first time, maybe they're returning and they're going on a bus again, but things are different. We want to know what those things are, right? So this means working with your child's teacher to find out what those new steps and regulations and routines and rules are to getting on and off the bus and riding the bus, right? So this is going to be a team effort. This is something that parents need to work with teachers, and teachers need to work with their entire division over what those rules and regulations are. So we need to communicate very well between all of these groups, right? So we want to talk about, maybe is there a way that we can create a visual support for your child? Maybe that's something the teacher can help with, that we can work through together. We want to find out all those rules so that we can make a social narrative. That's something that you as a family member can do to help support your child before they even get to that first day of school, because they've got to ride the bus before they get to school for that first day. So we want to prepare them ahead of time. So find out what those steps are, find out what those rules are, and make a story. And social narratives, again, you can go to our website, you can learn more about those, but it's just a step-by-step, very simple story. We're not Harry Potter. We're not making a very fancy story here. These are really simple, one sentence per page that just explains what's happening. If there's a video, watch that video with your child again and again. I've been very impressed to see a lot of divisions across the nation who are really stepping up and taking a proactive approach and helping prepare all children, not just children with ASD, but all children for what's happening. And what are they doing? They're making social narratives and they're creating videos. These are fantastic tools. Make sure you use it if it's available. I also want to add to plan something motivating for when your child gets off the bus that can be used with a first then support. A first then visual support is just something that says, first I'm going to do something that I don't really like, then I'm going to follow it up with something that I do prefer. And it's just a way to motivate someone to get through a transition and get through a routine or a schedule, okay? So make sure you try and plan something motivated that can be used to say, we're going to ride the bus. It's not great. It's not fun. Maybe it's not what we want to do, but when we get done, we get to do this really great thing that you love. Preparing for a drop-off or pickup. Again, we're going to say this a lot. Talk with your child's teacher. Communication and teaming is really, really important. So we want to know what those steps are. We want to know maybe how can we make a visual support ahead of time. We want to make that social narrative that uses those steps and talks about what might happen during that drop off. If there's a video, watch it. The really important thing is to be consistent. This is true for all things with children with ASD. They really thrive in routine, consistent environments. And so if you have a consistent drop-off or pickup routine, that's going to help that child feel confident and safe and secure and comfortable with what's happening. You can also use a transition activity or a transition item. Some children have a special interest that really helps support them in different ways, and sometimes that's supporting them through a transition. So think about those strengths and interests and how that you can use that as well. Temperature checks. So I have a child with ASD. I also have a child that had other health impairments, and so he had brain surgery when he was 9. I have helped my children through a lot of medical procedures. So my child with ASD, when he was very young, we weren't quite sure if it was autism or if it was something else, and so we had things like MRIs. He had EEG studies to see if he had seizure activity. He had blood work. My child with brain surgery obviously had a lot of medical procedures. And I can tell you that social narratives saved us just so many different times, because we could talk about what was going to happen and we could explain it. We had visual supports there, and then we could practice. Now, I couldn't practice brain surgery at home, obviously not that, but we could practice all the things that would help us get ready for those steps. What might happen? So you can absolutely prepare a child for temperature checks, just by practicing that at home. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat here, and it says, I had a young adult who may be returning to his work program. We'll actually get to those at the very end, if you don't mind. We're going to get to the questions at the end, so we'll come back to that. Multiple transitions or altering schedules. Make sure that you actually use consistent home routines at home and that you use a visual schedule. Those things will prepare a child for using routines and schedules at school. So if you don't have a visual schedule at home, or you don't have kind of regular consistent routines, I would really urge you to do that and to consider how can you incorporate those into your daily life at home, because then we have something that we have some experience with, right? We know what a routine is, we know what a schedule is. It may be a little different at school, but I also have that there. Using first then visual supports are great. Using a calendar to identify days that maybe I'll be at school or days that I'll be at home if I'm not going Monday through Friday. We can also use a task analysis for teaching routines like hand washing, and we're going to get to that one in just a second. And then actually you can incorporate hand washing throughout the day at home to prepare a child for all the hand washing that's going to happen at school. Mask or face shield, you can create a social narrative about this. You can watch age-appropriate videos about it, and you can practice wearing one at home and in the community so that they understand that it's not scary. It's there to keep people healthy. Quarantines and school closures, we can prepare a social narrative for that. But if you're already in a quarantine, we can use a calendar to mark off the days that have passed, right? So the child can see, okay, I've got 9 days that have passed. I've got a few more before I can go back. You can also use things like, if you're not sure if this child might be sick, you can use things like today I feel, right? Maybe there's a picture of a body and there's different things like maybe I feel like my head hurts or I have a hard time breathing. You can use visual supports to ask a child during that time how that they're feeling so that you can keep track. You can watch age-appropriate videos about quarantines. Some of those are available on the VCUA's website, and some are available on places like Autism Speaks. You can use physical structure in the home to mark off spaces that are okay to use. A lot of times when we're in a quarantine, we need to make sure that everybody's not interacting and mingling and doing all this stuff. So there might be a space in the house where your child needs to stay, and dad or mom who might have been exposed need to be in another part of the house. And so there's ways to mark that off and to say, wait a minute, stop before you go in here. So we can use visual supports for that, and we can use routines and schedules at home. So we've talked about a lot of changes, and again, we may not cover all of them that are going to happen for every division across the state. And so if there's something that has popped up that maybe we haven't talked about, think about using all the things that we have suggested and altering it or individualizing it for that particular unique change for your school. But let's take one particular issue. We're going to talk about hand washing really quickly, and we're going to go through this together. Like, what does this look like from start to finish when we are thinking about where do we even start with this? How do we prepare our child who maybe, maybe we're lucky to get them to wash their hands before they eat, or maybe it's just when it's bath time at the end of the day. How are we going to prepare this child for the sheer amount of hand washing that's going to happen once they go to school? So where do you start? Well, Stephanie mentioned a task analysis earlier, and a task analysis, it sounds really fancy. It's really not. It's a way to just break down a skill. Like when we talk about hand washing, you think of it as one step, right? Hand washing is actually a lot of steps. And for some children, there might be a lot more steps. And for other children, we might have fewer steps. It just depends on the child. So what I mean by that is if I were to say, go wash your hands. So it sounds like one step, right? But you actually have to go to a room with a sink, for one thing. You might have to open the door. You're going to have to stand in front of the sink. If you're smaller, like a very young child with ASD, you might have to use a step-up stool. So you're going to have to get that out. You're going to have to turn on the water. You're going to have to put your hands under the water. You're going to have to rub your hands. You're going to have to put the soap on. You're going to have to, I mean, there's so many steps, right? So what we want you to do is think about that skill. Think about everything that's involved in hand washing. Write down those steps. Create the next step then is to take that and make a visual support from that. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that's a whole lot of work. I don't know that I have time to do all this. Well, thankfully, VCUAs and other places like Autism Speaks and some other places have already created a task analysis for you and have created visual supports on hand washing. So we've already thought about all the steps that you're going to need to do, and we've created visual supports that you can use. Now, you may have to individualize it so these are just some stock photos off of the internet about sinks and hands and soap. Your child may need to know their specific sink and their specific soap that they use, and it might need to be pictures of their hands. So you might have to make a more specific visual support, but all you do is take those steps in that task analysis and put it in a visual format, right? And then you can model that skill yourself. Now on this link here, it just takes you to a video that VCUAs has on hand washing. So we did this task analysis, and then I videotaped myself washing my hands many, many times to get it just right. So that we can show this to other children and that they can learn that skill just by watching it over and over again. Sometimes it's easier for a child with ASD to learn from a video than it is from watching their parent or their teacher washing their hands. So you could do both. You should always model the skill yourself because we're good role models as parents, right? And teachers, we should always be modeling the things that we want to see in our children. But sometimes a video model is easier for a child with ASD to watch again and again and again. They can rewind, they can stop, and they can do it all over again. Oh, whoops, excuse me. Hitting the wrong thing there. Okay, why is it not fast forwarding? There we go. So what else can we do? Stephanie, do you want to take prompting?
Sure. So as we talked about, prompting is just giving that assistance, a little bit of additional help in order for that target skill to occur, right? That behavior, that response, whatever you want that you're working on to occur. So if you've done that task analysis, you have all those smaller steps broken down. We really want to have kind of one step, one action per piece of that task analysis when we have it written out and when we're putting it in a visual support. So really just the teaching part, the prompting is going to really depend. I think the best way to put this is to observe, right? Allow for that independence. When you say wash your hands or you have that visual support or whatever, however you've had it set up, and then really sit back and kind of watch and sort of observe what takes place so that you as a parent kind of know when do I allow them to be independent and I see that they have success, but where are they getting maybe hung up or stuck or seem to have difficulty. I can remember being in a classroom and it might be the going for the paper towel and pulling the paper towel might have been tricky for the student, or ripping the paper towel off of the paper towel dispenser. So really observing, kind of taking, I'm not saying you have to sit there with a clipboard and take data or do anything that's very kind of difficult or unnatural, but really observing so that the next time that you get to that step or that part of the whole skill of hand washing, you can intervene and the child can be successful, because what you want to do is be able to provide that reinforcement. So we'll talk about that in just a second. One of the things that we always want is independence is key here, right? thinking about adulthood. I mean, the more that your child is able to do on their own, the better, right? For their quality of life, and also for you, so that you can get things done probably in your home, and not have to always be helping with all of those steps of hand washing. So what we want to really think about is, really what we call prompt fading. And so, if you've repeated something a few times and you've used sort of what we call that verbal prompt, so you've given the direction of wash your hands or get the paper towel, think about what else could I use? Could I point to that visual and just give a little bit of wait time? And maybe the child will be able to do that independently if I back off. Sometimes young children, especially with ASD, may need that extra wait time for things to process. And also, again, using that strength of the visual, sometimes the verbal, that connection isn't there yet. You always kind of pair it, but you might have to fade that out, right? And you want to do that because we do want skills to be mastered and independent in order for that skill to kind of stick and it be a part of their repertoire. So that's just some little tips there as far as prompting goes. So I think this is probably the most important because, as I mentioned, reinforcement by definition increases the likelihood that that skill, that target behavior, or that response you want is going to occur. So you always want to pair reinforcement. So when you see that skill taking place, you want to be able to provide something. It may be a high five, a good job, it's going to be really specific to your individual child because not everything is reinforcing. So something that might really motivate and be reinforcing to me is not necessarily for other people. So you want to really individualize, but the more that you can do that, then the next go around when that comes up again, where, oh, it's my turn to do this again, and you see, wow, this time they got the paper towel on their own, or whatever it was that you were working on in that step, really making a big deal about that so that that hopefully increases the likelihood that that happens again and again. And then that skill will eventually be, that part of the step in that bigger complex skill will now be mastered.
Excellent. And I just want to reiterate something that Stephanie had said just a few minutes ago, especially when she was talking about prompting, was that the ultimate goal for this is for this child to be independent, right? To independently be able to go in and do hand washing at home or at school or in the community. But especially at home right now, if we have family members who are working at home, which is happening all across the nation, and we have children at home, we need our children to be as independent as possible. So when we talk about some of these things, whether it's hand washing or think about other parts of your day, all the things we've talked about help increase that independence. So making that task analysis, creating that visual support, using prompting and reinforcement ultimately is going to help a child be more independent. So what else can you do when we're talking about hand washing? Now it's time to think about adding in a social narrative. You've talked about how to work on the actual skill itself, but let's explain why it's so important to wash our hands right now. So VCUACE has created a social narrative for younger children. So you can use the one that we've created. I know Autism Speaks has already created one about COVID-19 for all different ages. You can also create one that you just make yourself. You can use PowerPoints to do it. I use something called Canva. There's all kinds of ways to make a very simple social narrative. It can be, maybe you just take pictures and you put it on a piece of paper and you write out some of the story, okay? All kinds of ways to do it, but make sure that we talk about why it's so important to do this right now, because children need to know. Remember, we're going to presume competence in all of our children. Now, that one last thing that I want to talk about is creating this visual schedule for you to use at home, because this is something they're going to have at school. And so we can prepare them for this transition by doing some of this stuff at home. And so you can create a very simple visual schedule that's like, I wake up, I wash my hands, I brush my teeth, I eat breakfast, maybe I get to go play some Legos, and maybe I have some read time with dad. And then before I eat lunch, I wash my hands. So we're incorporating that hand washing throughout the day, but we also have it in a visual schedule so that the child can see what's going to happen. So this is a great way to do any kind of routine that's going to happen in your day and show a child what's going to happen. It doesn't have to just be hand washing, but hand washing is obviously a really important one right now. So part of the thing, we've talked about a lot of resources today. We talked about some of the social narratives that VCUACE has. We've talked about some of the visual supports that you might use. We actually have a lot of resources on our main website at that vcuasautismcenter.org, where you can find, there's actually a section that says COVID-19. So you want to hit that thing there, and it'll take you right to a lot of our resources. We also have an early childhood playlist on YouTube. It will say the channel is VCU RRTC. That's just kind of the parent organization for the Autism Center, so don't get confused. It's all the one and the same. But we have a lot of great videos that will help explain some of these things in more detail for you, whether it's maintaining routines and schedules at home, or hand washing, or even just explaining what COVID-19 is. All of that stuff is there, and you can use that, as well as some of the other resources we talked about in other places. And your division may also have resources as well. So your child's school, talk with your child's teacher and see if they have really specific resources that are for that building that your child's going to be going into that classroom. So I know that we've said a lot, and I know we've said it very quickly. And again, we don't expect everybody to be experts as they walk out of this, but if you have some questions, maybe that's a good time to go over some of the things that you have concerns about, or you know, just that, like, how would I do this, or how would I explain that? You can use the chat feature. So if you look on the little menu on your Zoom, there should be mute and all these other things, I think, and there should be a chat feature. So you can pull that up. And we already had somebody ask one earlier about returning to work. So this is not an early childhood situation, but you know, I would really focus on all of these things. And VCUACE does have some really good stuff for older children as well. Like we had one about wearing a mask. We had one about, there's a lot of resources on how to be independent at home and things like that. So there are some resources for older students as well on our website that you can really use for that. Noelle, thank you that we have provided some excellent strategies. And this is a great point that Noelle brings up. These aren't helpful for just students with ASD. These are helpful for all children. They are just especially beneficial for students with ASD. So if you have a cousin that's getting ready to send their child to preschool and that child doesn't have ASD, you can use these same tools and strategies that we've talked about with that child, and they're going to help them as well. Does anybody else have any questions?
Alicia, I'm going to launch the poll if that's okay.
Yeah. I think you might see a poll at some point here. There it is. So if you just want to add in what is your relationship, where you're located, and was this information useful, go ahead and fill that out, and then we'll keep going to the chat here. It looks like we have a question on how can we access all the resources that you have given us? Will we have access to this presentation? You'll absolutely have access to this presentation. It generally takes a couple of days to be put up on our website and on YouTube. But if you go to where you registered for this link, so there it is right there from Stacy, the vcuautismcenter.org, under Lunch and Learn, you can find this particular video. It's also on our YouTube channel. And all of the resources that we've talked about, like the social narratives and some of the things that will explain all of those strategies, are also on our website. So that vcuautismcenter.org, that's your main hub to go for all of this information. Any other questions? I'll wait a few more minutes just in case you have a question that just pops up in your head. I will say, in terms of early childhood stuff that's happening, I like to plug this. I don't want to go too far into it because we don't have the actual link yet, but Stephanie and I are very excited about this, is that we're going to have an early childhood specific part of the website. So we're going to have an early childhood sort of repository where you can go and find resources for very young children. Our website can get kind of complex and hard to navigate, and there's a lot for all age groups. And so we want to make sure it's really easy to find resources that are specific to very young children. And as soon as that is ready, we are definitely going to share that with everybody because we want you to use that. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide here. Next week, So today we talked about preparing your child for going back to school, but because we know in the time of COVID-19, everything is kind of fluid and flexible and we don't always know what's going to happen. So there may be some situations where young children are not able to go to preschool for whatever reason. Maybe we have to use a virtual option because there is an outbreak in our community. Maybe it's just for a semester, maybe it's for a month, who knows, right? But we want to also prepare families and young children for that virtual option as well. So next week, we're going to really switch gears and talk about home and what you can do at home and how families can really support this process and how teachers can work with families to make virtual options really more than, you know, kind of just something that you check off on your list, right? That you're doing every day. Oh, I sat down for a Zoom session. We want to make that time that you have at home and using those virtual options really meaningful. So join us next week where we talk about that and we kind of go into more depth about what we can do at home. And if you have any more questions, here's that website that we want you to go to, or if you have any questions, you can email right here at this address. And we will see you next week for our next session on preparing for virtual options. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any last questions, here's your last chance.
Thank you, Alicia and Stephanie.
Thank
It
you,
was
Stacey.
wonderful. Have a great weekend, everybody.